Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Anxiety RX podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Kennedy, a medical doctor who struggled with crippling anxiety for many, many years. And I like to deal with the art and the science of anxiety. I believe that anxiety is far too scientifically driven these days, the treatment of it, this evidence-based therapy and all that kind of thing. I think we're mind, body, and spirit, and I think we need to assess the spirit and access the spirit to heal from anxiety. We can feel better with cognitive therapies, but it's not really going to help us. It's not really going to help us feel at the root cause of the anxiety. You can think better, is what I wanted to say, but you can't really, heal it from just purely empirical scientific methods alone, because the spirit can't be reduced. So today I have with me Amy Green Smith from North Carolina, and we're going to talk about, people pleasing, fawning, following, all this kind of thing that actually feeds into this anxiety, this feeling like we're what I call object referred. We're referred outside of ourselves. We lose ourselves and we start focusing on how is the other person. So, Amy, that was a rather long introduction. Why do you do this work, and tell us a bit about you?
Sure. So I think not dissimilar to you, a lot of times we end up in our chosen career field, or I guess it chooses us because we were struggling with something. And my journey through really being heavily invested in the opinions of other people was probably the most acute way that my anxiety would show up. There was this constant state of worry around what other people were thinking and falsifying ramifications that I was completely fabricating in my own mind. And, for a bit of context, I grew up in an extremely conservative, born again Christian family. My father had a master's in divinity and a doctorate in ministry, so he was not fucking around.
No.
And so I had quite a bit of religious dogma, lots of intense indoctrination around what constituted being worthy and being a good girl. And juxtaposed against my two younger siblings, I was, by all accounts, the good kid. I started working when I was 14, put myself through college, got married young, moved out of the house. And both my siblings had trouble with the law, did jail time, didn't go to school, pretty textbook. And that will come full circle here in a minute. And then in 2007, my father passed away. And at the time, I was transitioning between working as a makeup artist into working in the personal development field. And so I felt very convicted that I wanted to do the makeup for his viewing. So you've reached the dead dad makeup portion of the show, everybody.
Wow.
And I also felt very strongly that I wanted to speak at his service. So needless to say, I felt like I was winning at daughter that day.
Right.
We get back home to my mom's house, and she finds it the most opportune time to say that she feels as though my father and her had failed as parents because the three of us, looping me in with my younger brothers, were not subscribed to the faith traditions we were raised with. That her words were, "You are not, quote, walking with the Lord." And the only thing I could kind of muster in that moment was to say, you probably shouldn't say that to a child. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe there's a teaching moment here.
Right.
And she said, well, that's just how I feel. And I'll tell you what, Russ, up until that time, I was sort of a master shapeshifter. Every time my partner and I would go home to visit my parents, I would say, okay, no cussing, no drinking, no talking about Jon Stewart, no South Park, no liberal agenda, like just
Take it, you guys.
yeah. I'm going home.
Yeah.
Yeah. So none of it, like just keep it all under wraps. And this was such a pivotal moment for me because I was so done putting up that veneer and that artifice. And I also think I was a bit more bolstered by the fact that now it was kind of 1-to-1 as opposed to 1-to-2 with my father being gone. And that opened up the floodgates, and that I became incredibly adversarial and combative. I wanted to fight. I wanted to litigate. And it wasn't until many, many times where I had to walk back my delivery with my mom that I realized, oh, wow, you can actually advocate for yourself, have difficult conversations, ask for a divorce, ask children to move out of the house, tell your family that you don't believe in the religion you were raised in, and you can do all of that with the utmost grace and kindness. And so oftentimes, instead of what I think many people do, is when we're at odds with someone else, we take back everything, including our opinions, including our stances, because we're so uncomfortable in that unrest. And so I would circle back to her and say, hey, listen, I still feel very strongly about what we conversed about, but I should never have said it in that way. And for that, I'm really, really sorry. You didn't deserve to be spoken to in that way. So I started cultivating and learning how to advocate for myself with grace and kindness, but also with assertiveness. And because I was involved in the coaching world already, I had the great privilege of learning lots of tools and modalities. And so now the work that I do in the world is kind of twofold. It's this internal component of genuinely believing in your intrinsic, inherent worthiness, enoughness. And then this external component of, okay, if that's true, if that now is a part of my subconscious, how does that affect my external relationships? What does it look like? What are the actual phrases or semantics of having a tough conversation, saying no, establishing boundaries? And that, so it has come quite full circle from needing to do it myself and now being able to teach others to do the same.
So many things there that I wanted to jump on. So when you said litigate, what did you mean by that?
I meant that I wanted to fight for rightness as opposed to discussing things in a way in which I could be heard. We know from the work of Dr. John Gottman that we will not make change unless we feel understood. So, I mean, you can't look much further than our political climate, right? Like we're litigating our case. We're fighting to be right and to stand in that righteousness, as opposed to looking at what other people's experiences are and trying to find that understanding, because that's really the only thing that cultivates change.
Yeah. And when you said your story to your mother, what was the reception you got?
You mean
When you said, like, during that little monologue you did, was that you talked about you
yes.
approached your mother in a different way, you apologized, and what kind of reception did you
Oh,
get to that apology?
I see what you're saying. Yes. Well, this is crazy, Russ, because a couple of times it was like she would not even acknowledge what I said. So I would have this very vulnerable lead in where I would kind of say, hey, you really didn't deserve to be treated that way. And she would look at me straight in the eyes and then say, have you talked to your brother today?
Mm.
And I'm like, okay, well,
Right.
she didn't have the capacity to engage in that conversation. And
Or accept, like
right.
accept positive feeling. I mean, I don't know what your parents' marriage was like, but it sounded like your father was pretty dictatorial.
No, actually,
Okay.
you'd be surprised. He was so loving and he was genuinely an incredible human. And that's one of the things that I think can be tricky about working around childhood issues is sort of the dichotomous emotions that come up around it, where they were unbelievably loving and kind, but they were also a part of a belief system that caused a lot of harm.
Mm.
So even though I always felt like I had a safe place, that I could be who I was, I had such a stringent rule book, and a lot of the detriment happened for me amongst the organizations more than it did from my family of origin. So the pressure was from like this Christian schools and the churches and the leadership, et cetera. But I do still reckon with that a little bit, that I do believe with every part of my being that they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing,
Hmm.
that it wasn't coming from a place of malice, that they
Right.
did do their own work. My father early on would say, this is back in the days when spanking was not necessarily up for debate,
Mm.
as and so if he disciplined us, he would come to me and he would, say, I disciplined you out of anger instead of out of love, and that's not okay. And so I want to ask for your forgiveness. And so I
Mm,
learned very early on that there was a motivation behind our behavior, and that
right.
there are times that that motivation needs to be cleaned up.
Okay, here's an off-center question. Was your father's the first dead body you ever saw?
uh, yes, and I believe the only one.
Mm,
I feel like I would have a recollection if there was another, but yes, and I immediately went into work mode. I
right.
disassociated. But I felt like it would be an asshole move to be like, Dad, get your own makeup artist when I had
Yeah,
this full skill set.
sure. Because, it's funny when you said that. It was like, because my father's dead body was the first dead body that I've ever seen, even before, and it was well before medical school. So it's
Mm,
just really interesting that your experience with death with your father, was so guttural and literal and feeling based.
yeah.
Like it's so intense when you come face to face with something you've always seen with some life force in it when it's gone.
Yeah.
So it just,
Mm,
if you saw him as a loving, caring figure, that would be, a need for dissociation. Like you would have to, I think anybody would have to dissociate regardless of what kind of a parent that they were in the first place. But it's just,
yeah.
I find that really interesting of just how people respond to their first dead body if they've ever seen it. Because, once I got into medical school, they were all over the place. I mean,
Sure.
we had 21 in our anatomy lab and all this kind of thing too. So where do you think your people pleasing comes from then? Like what do you think that the core people pleasing, fabric in you
Yeah.
came from?
I think a lot of it was analogous to perfectionism,
Mm,
coming from this idea of what a good girl was.
mm,
And even though my parents were not rigid about academics or things like that, or you need to, achieve all of these things, I was one of those incredibly sensitive children that took all of that stuff very, very seriously. And it's interesting talking to other survivors of religious trauma, how that's one of the things that tends to be in parallel, where I have some colleagues and friends who were raised in a really rigid dogma, but they didn't internalize it nearly as much as I did. And so for me, it felt like there was no wiggle room, and that really continued on into in my adult life. And one of the things that I think people pleasing gets a bit of a misnomer, or kind of
bad
a
rap.
false react what was that?
A bad rap.
Well, it just that people don't understand that it's part of us genuinely taking care of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not necessarily a bad thing, and that it's oftentimes rooted in wanting to be connected with other people, to be uh, accepted into the tribe, so to speak.
Right.
And also, I think there's a misunderstanding that it's always people who are really demure and maybe have a repressed posture and maybe aren't gregarious or outspoken. But people pleasing can affect the highest of achievers, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
can affect the most gregarious and extroverted folks. So oftentimes, if somebody doesn't identify with the moniker of people pleasing, I will say, okay, but do you find that you are highly invested in the opinions of other people? And they'll
Sure.
say, yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, well, welcome to people pleasing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, it's true. So, where I see a lot of people in people pleasing is that, when you're younger, if mom or dad isn't okay, either am I.
exactly.
So it's like, okay, how do I make them okay? And then you get all sorts of praise and all sorts of acceptance for giving the parent what they need. And Gabor Mate talks about this too, is like you release your authentic self in order to maintain the attachment. So what you do is you start getting really, really good, especially if you're sensitive, at reading other people
That's
and
exactly right.
giving them what they need, right? Because you do get fed by it in a sort of a backhanded kind of way.
Hmm.
But the problem with that is if you can be people pleasing, but you give yourself the option. Like if you go in and you say, okay, I could people please right here, or I could just stay within my own authentic self. That's different than every time, when someone's in distress, that you have to jump in and fix it. And that's what I see with a lot of my, clients, patients, whatever you want to call them, is that they don't have the option. It's just so automatic. It's so subconscious, unconscious, whatever you want to call it. It's so
Yeah.
automatic that they can't break that cycle. And it's painful. When they try not to do it, it's actually physically painful for them.
Absolutely. And I think that's where being trauma informed and having an understanding of like what actually can send someone into crisis or not is incredibly important. But something that you're circling around that I think warrants underlining is the motivation for people pleasing can be I see it in two major camps. One that we're talking about here is self-preservation, right? So if you grew up in a family with a volatile caregiver, let's say, you develop a positive association with people pleasing because it was the mechanism for you to stay safe.
Right.
So learning how to acquiesce, learning how to say like, oh, whatever you want, that now is registered in the mind as a positive thing. This is something that I know I can lean on in order to stay safe. Now, the opposite side of the camp then is people pleasing as a mechanism of outsourcing your self-worth. So we see this a lot sort of in workplace scenarios where maybe I want to please my boss or gain favor so that I can sustain my livelihood, so that I don't lose my bread and butter, right? That's a mechanism of people pleasing out of self-preservation. Conversely, you could be saying, I need this person to approve of me and value me in order to feel worthy, in order to feel like I'm a viable, valuable human. And sometimes these get a bit enmeshed. But understanding that, I think, is incredibly important. I think a lot of women, or those who are who have been socialized as women or are femme presenting, can relate to appeasing a man, acquiescing to not get murdered, right? Like at a bar or something like that. That's a perfect example of using that defense mechanism to stay safe. But I would also argue that a majority of us are leaning on an old defense in situations where we're actually not in danger.
Right.
But as you've talked about many times, now it's wired into that subconscious part of the mind, right? So now when we have cognitive therapies or conscious exercises where you want to say an affirmation like I'm capable of speaking up to for myself, but there is a disconnect in that subconscious faculty of the mind. That inner critic, the guard dog of the subconscious, is going to kick that shit out every single time.
Yeah.
And be like, get out of here. No, you can't. So another reason why I think you and I are aligned too in looking at alternative modalities that work with different faculties of the mind in order to create sustained change.
Interesting you mentioned females there too, because Shelley Taylor, I think her last name's Taylor, I'm pretty sure Shelley Taylor, PhD, has this concept of females being tend and befriend. Like when they get into a stress reaction, their system secretes more oxytocin than, say, would a male in the same environment. So when you have all this oxytocin running around in your system, you're much more likely to try and tend and befriend in that situation than stick up for yourself. So, and this is also cultural too. Like women in our culture tend to be more submissive than males. It's just basically biological how we're wired. So it is really interesting to see this kind of work. And this is maybe one of the reasons why women stay in relationships that are very, very stressful for them, because the stress actually fires up their oxytocin, which paradoxically makes them want to be closer to the person that's causing the problem, which I think we do as well with our parent. We want to be closer to the parent. So we acquiesce to them. We kind of decide. And what it's reminded me a little bit of, like when your mother said, are you walking with the Lord? It's kind of like, well, I've chosen not to be that way. And can you as an adult human being be safe in that environment where you can say to your mother, no, I don't believe in this particular deity. It's not really part of my belief system. And they say, well, I love you. It's like, well, is that really love when you're sort of, it's so conditional on you believing the same thing that they do?
Yeah, and this is an interesting conversation around how gender could inform that, because one of the things that I've thought about a lot lately is the conditioning that women receive early on, right? Like if you look at our
Hmm.
toys are like, hey, you need to caretake for these babies. You need to learn how to cook. We're not getting the science kit, at least coming up in the 70s and 80s. Like you didn't get your science kit and shit like that. You learned that you needed to take care of others. And then we also have social idioms like girls mature faster than boys. And it's like, okay, or are we not demanding maturity from boys early on? Right. So I think that there's definitely biology that's at play, but a lot of social conditioning as well. And something that I think is important for us to understand when we look at the pull to people please is that it's part of our primitive defense mechanism, right? So, you mentioned fawn. If we're going to fawn in the face of a captor or an aggressor, primitively, let's say it's a mountain lion coming at me, to fawn in the face of that danger might be like, here, kitty, kitty, go get some meat over there. We're trying
Mm.
to be gentle,
Right.
right? And so all of those primitive defense mechanisms have modern iterations. People pleasing is one of them. But if you think about even Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example,
Okay.
one of our basic human needs is for one of belonging. So if we feel like we might lose that safety because somebody in our life doesn't like us or is abusive, even to your point, we go, oh my gosh, I might not survive this. And that is not a conscious thought. It's usually very much a subconscious thought. But the idea is I need to belong in order to survive. And so we develop these kind of shape-shifting behaviors around that. Um,
Yeah, and
yeah.
culturally, it's almost like when I was listening to what you were saying there. I mean, the commercial environment that we live in. So females are much more likely to be sort of young females attracted to dolls, whereas young males are attracted to trucks. So it is one of those things. So even the cultural financial environment is okay. Well, we're going to sell more dolls to women or to females than we are to males. So that's what we're gonna produce. Now
Yeah,
there is a smaller percentage of females that aren't born with that sort of nurturing spirit. There's also a small percentage of males that are born with that nurturing spirit. So it's
totally.
kind of like, we get railroaded down this particular thing, both culturally and, through our economic systems that
Yes.
reinforce these needs or these, underlying predispositions, I guess you might call them. And
Yeah.
then if it's not who you are, like when you were saying, like, I'm not someone who follows a particular deity,
Yeah.
we
Yes.
get this dissonance between, okay, this is how we were raised, this is our culture, and like, do you feel like you're on some level, part of you is like, I should be walking with the Lord? Like, is there a
Yes.
part of you in you? And then how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, yeah, that's really difficult because I can say very concretely now that there's no pull. There's absolutely no pull. And I actually view a lot of that as being highly abusive.
Mm.
Being somebody who talks about enoughness and worthiness, to grow up where the entire religious text is predicated on this notion that you are not whole and that
Yes.
you need saving. I don't know any other way to tell a child you are inherently not enough. And to me, that is incredibly damaging. And so there, and purity culture, all sorts of different things, the relationships with money, with your body, gender stereotypes. There's so much damage that was done there. So I find myself still dancing in the grief cycle where,
Mm.
as we know, part of grief can be the anger. And so the more I've kind of learned about it and come through it, because I'm been out of that world for 2 decades plus.
Mm.
And so now that I look at it through a different lens, it's honestly almost laughable. But where I get the most triggered is around politics
Okay.
because it's hard for me to see anything that's going on without having a religious impetus, whether we're talking about where most people were when the founding of our country, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but yeah, it's curious to talk about some of those socialization things. I was thinking when you were talking about the economics of it, during World War II, when a lot of women went to work
Mm.
in all of these traditional male fields and fucking loved it. And then the dudes came home and were like, oh, we can't have this. So that's when you saw this massive commercial uh, amplification of, you need this new
Mm-hmm.
vacuum cleaner and you need
Yeah.
this new blender, and women, this is where your place is. And you also saw a shit ton of like legalized cocaine happening with the diet pills and stuff of that. Women weren't happy,
Yeah.
right? So I think
Milltown, barbiturates.
that's
That
right.
was a big, they used to market that. Are you stressed? Are you a stressed woman in 1960s? Milt is like barbiturates are one of of the most deadly medications. They work, they relax you for sure, but you take too many and it will kill you quite
Mhm.
handily. So
Yeah,
it's fascinating to see how the cultural, war was something that fired everybody up. And one of my dictums is that human beings don't do anything until the pain of what they're doing becomes greater than the pain of trying to fix it.
that's right.
So we just stay with it, for so long, which is an unfortunate part of our wiring for sure.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
if you look at Trump in a way, it's like he's kind of a religious deity.
Oh, 100%.
So it's like it doesn't matter how immoral he is or whatever, because he's seen as a religious deity, all bets are off. There is no comeuppance, there is no accountability, there isn't. It's just like he's a
Yeah,
cult figure. And I
that's
think the
right.
more stressed the society becomes, the more they look for certainty and the more they look for belonging. So and
Mhm.
also, if you're in a minority, and Trump followers are a minority, there
Mhm.
is a certain level of belonging in that. There's a heightened sense of belonging in that, which is
Yeah.
very, very addictive for human beings. So
Mhm.
especially when we get into a place where the world is quite uncertain, so people will look for certainty. And
Mhm.
regardless of how flawed a figure is, it's almost
Yes.
like the more flawed they are, if I follow them, I will find my own tribe. And then in
Mhm.
that belonging, I'll be safe.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because I've worked with a religious trauma therapist who I really love, and he was sharing that he had to be really careful going from such a religious perspective and then moving into the opposite, but becoming just as heretical about his liberalism and how
Right.
wrong is it. And so I've been really trying to catch myself. It took me many, many years till I could even say the word God,
Mm.
because it was such it exemplified so many painful experiences for me. And also, I mean, we haven't even talked about this. I identify as queer. So I shut that shit down real
Of
quick.
course.
All of my first experiences were with girls, and I remember we had some Christian book teaching you about sex, and there was some passage that said it's normal to experiment up until the age of 12, but after that, now they might actually be gay, and we
Mm.
can't have that, right?
Right.
So I remember my first kiss, all of that stuff, like I shut it down. I said I went all the way up until like my 13th birthday. And then I was like, okay, I guess dudes from now on.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of anger about that.
Sure.
And so I still have to kind of do that dance with grief, and I have to mitigate myself from becoming heretical or fanatical about the stuff that I believe in now, because
Mm.
I have to keep that same tenet that we were talking about earlier, that we all just want to be understood. To your
Sure.
point, that's nobody signs up for a cult. Nobody does that. They sign up for a solution to their pain, to somebody who's hurt, who
Sure.
hears them or sees them. Nobody signs up for that. And, arguably, folks who end up in abusive relationships, that's a cult of one, right?
Mm,
Like where you're still rooting for them to be
right.
the solution or the savior, right? Yeah.
Yeah, what Hollis calls the magical other, right? Like
Mm,
someone's going to come along and be the parent to me that I didn't have. It's
right.
kind of funny. So with you, like kind of this, I find it really interesting is that you were raised in a template of worship.
Uh-huh.
So I see people who are raised in a fervent template of worship, kind of going from, God to absolutely no God the other way, right?
Uh-huh.
Because, and even that's a form of worship. When you
Hmm.
worship, there's no God. So it's like, it's refreshing to see that you're, embracing both. You're kind of seeing those, unconscious or subconscious proclivities and kind of going, okay, I can see my mother's point. I can see
Hmm.
that faith does provide, and I talk about this in my book, and both the first one and the second one, about how important faith is in healing the spirit and healing anxiety.
Yeah.
Not necessarily religious faith, though. It's
Right.
mostly kind of faith in yourself, because when you get traumatized as a child, we lose faith in the world. Like
Hmm.
we lose, and then on top, the corollary of that, that's maybe even more damaging, is that we start believing that everything's up to us. And if you
Right.
start to believing everything is up to you and you're a 7-year-old queer girl, this
Hmm.
is going to be a very, very difficult world to manage.
That's right. That's right. Well, and the worship piece does not sit well with me at all. It never did. In fact, when I was going to coming up in Christian school, it was they would tell us the story of Abraham and Isaac, which is, Abraham is told by God to kill his child as a test of faith.
Mm,
And it you know, in the medical field, we would call that psychopathy and
hmm.
manipulation, right?
Yep.
And by the way, the Christian God is a serial killer and a
Yeah.
narcissist who needs constant praise.
There you go.
But I never I would raise my hand and be like, "Wait a minute. So you're telling me, I would tell my teacher, you're telling me if God told you to just go ahead and sacrifice your kid, you'd just have faith in that?" To me, that
So what
never
did they say?
made.
What did they what would they say when you
They
said
would
that?
say, "Yes, Russ."
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, they would double down, but to your point, the cognitive dissonance is real,
Sure.
And, yeah, so I identify now as an agnostic atheist, and the way I describe that is, Gnosticism is knowing, right? I'm very clear that there's lots I don't know.
Right.
But as far as theism, I'm very, very clear that I do not believe in the God of the Bible or of the Abrahamic faiths.
Sure.
Now, if you're talking about God as a universal energy or about a higher power or a grouping of spirit guides or things like that, theist all day, right?
Sure.
It just depends on
Sure.
how you qualify what God is,
Yeah.
you know?
Because there is an order to the universe for sure. And it's like, it says that, I think the Bible says God made man in his own image, but it's actually the reverse, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Man made God in his own image. So there is this idea that we are these fundamental sinners, and we need this deity to sort of keep us on track. And
Right.
Jordan Peterson kind of talks about that too. It's like, there is a consciousness, and I do believe there is order. Because if you look at, science, if you look at proteins, if you look at the way
Mhm.
DNA is structured, it's just too random, like or it's just too ordered for it to be
Mhm.
random. There has to be some sort of order in the universe. Now, is that Jesus, Muhammad, Allah, whatever?
Yeah.
Probably not, but it's
Yes.
there is a certain benefit to belief. Part of it's belonging to a group.
Mhm.
Belonging is huge need for human beings, for sure. But part of it is it makes you, when if God tells you to kill your child, then well, God said it, so I have to do it. Now we would call that schizophrenia. We would call that
Mhm.
psychosis, right?
Yeah.
So it's sort of a mass, in a way. Organized religion is kind of a mass psychosis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's one in which we give all the spiritual space to. So if
Yeah.
I tell somebody, oh, I'm a witch, you know, that's like, what? You don't
Hmm.
get to have that spiritual space. But coming back to gender, this is a really interesting thought. I'm curious to hear what you might have to say about this. So I was given this book called In Defense of Witches, and it's actually very dense and kind of difficult to get through. But in the opening, in the introduction, it's actually somebody else who writes the intro. And she says, I want you to think about your first experience of a witch that was depicted in pop culture for you. Immediately for me, my first thought was Wicked Witch of the West. And then she says, okay, let me guess. Let me guess. She was a woman who opted not to get married.
Hmm.
She opted for a career that other people
Didn't have children.
did
Yeah.
not have children, and her closest friends were animals. And is socially maligned.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you've seen the posts about, like, we didn't burn witches, we burned women. And a lot of them were medical doctors.
Yes.
They were actually healers, right?
Yeah.
But we've been terrified of the power that women can possess. And I think by having not just terms like women, but or not just terms like witches, but also as women age, we've got the old hag, the spinster,
Crone. Yeah.
the crone, right?
Yeah.
Men age and they get to be a consummate bachelor or the silver fox, right? So we can't not look at some of the ways that we have used religion, even with witch trials in the US or overseas, where we have specifically kept women down. And so, of course, you have to think about, how do you stay safe in those situations? Probably people pleasing, right?
That
So,
would be one way. Yeah.
yeah, if you aren't physically having the strength to fight or to flee. So, yeah, I think it's interesting to look at all of the different facets of it. But again, this is my main growth edge, I think, is it's difficult for me to see anything that doesn't have some sort of nucleus of religious control in
Sure.
society.
Yeah, and there is an order. There kind of has to be an order. One of the jokes
Mhm.
that I used to talk about in stand up was that I'm just going to stopping at red lights because I see red lights as a sign of the patriarchy, and it slows me down. It doesn't get. I can't. How dare they slow me from getting from one side of the city to the other? So I'm just going to stopping at red lights because I don't believe in them. Now
Mhm.
we need a certain level of order, right? That's it.
Right.
And there is a certain amount of inherent maleness and inherent femaleness in
Mhm.
the let's see, the majority of the population. So, but that's starting to shift.
Mhm.
Now I look at teenagers now who go through a tremendous amount of angst and did so 50 years ago. And now with everything else going on, so some of the things when I talk to young people who are suffering from anxiety, one of the worst fears that they have is like, I might be gay. And there's no
Yeah.
way of refuting that, right? There's no way of saying, well, no, you're not, because I
Right.
think all of us are a bit gay. All of us have a little bit of
Yes.
attraction to our own sex for sure. So, and it's a gradation. Like some people it might be 10%, some people it might be 90%. So we're all this gradation. So the poor kids now are in this environment where they're so stressed. They're looking for a concretized version of
Mhm.
why they feel so stressed. And because am I gay can't be answered, it becomes
Mhm.
this blown up thing inside of them that they start going, okay, and then they start looking for the nuances of like, okay, what am I within the sexuality, again
Yeah.
taking everything back to there is this sense of order in the world. And it was that the men went to work, the women stayed home. There was an order in that, and society on some level worked at that point, but it's not working anymore. And as we lose order,
Mhm.
we lose the fabric of society. Divorces are an all-time high, all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of
Mhm.
like it's this balance between, okay, how can we maintain a sense of order yet give people this sort of sense of autonomy at the same time, and the
Right.
freedom to express their own autonomy,
Mhm.
because that threatens a lot of people, especially when it comes to religion. So this is all
Yes.
coming back. So religion says, no, you can't be gay. This is just an abomination. A man cannot
Yes.
lie with another man, right? Well, which I guess means camping is out. But so it's one of those things where you just sort of look at it like, okay, so I look at the world and I go, okay, well, we need order because people are freaking out these days. But the orders that we had before aren't working. Like there is this argument about the autonomous society versus the utilitarian. So the utilitarian society is the greatest good for the greatest number. Everyone stops at red lights. That's just how it goes. And then the autonomous is like, well, I'm free to explore my own religion, my own sexuality. And there's such a pushback against that. I think because it goes against this inherent sense of order that people feel safe in, even though it's oppressive in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's known, it's familiar. So
Yeah.
this is, I think, where we're getting in society now, is that we're kind of splintering out into these factions, and we're losing order in order to allow everyone to feel kind of welcomed and belonged. But the irony is that people are feeling more and more lonely all the time. Now, that was a big rant. So if there's anything you want to tack onto that, but I'm really sort of going at this now because I've been thinking so much about this lately.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, and I think it's really, really nuanced, because I think one of the reasons why it feels so prevalent now that people are exploring gender or sexual orientation is because there's finally a platform to do it.
Mm-hmm.
We know from, indigenous cultures who have a one spirit, which is neither male nor female, but rather sort of a third entity, and they're highly revered in some cultures. And they're essentially non-binary or trans. So a lot of this stuff isn't new at all. It's just now we have names for it. And now people are actually not being killed the way they used to be,
Right.
as in droves. But, I don't necessarily think that a healthy society is one that doesn't explore changes to order. And I do agree with you that of course we need some sort of semblance of order, but that has been built in a way, when we can see this with a lot of marginalized communities, through hierarchy of who matters the most, right? So we say, okay, thin, you're better than fat, and straight, you're better than queer, men, you're better than women. Like, clearly, even in the pay gap, we're still saying, no, you're worth more. So that paradigm is a very patriarchal perspective. And a matriarchal perspective is not necessarily to say, oh, we need women leading. It's to say we're all allowed to take up space here. And that bumps up against a lot of power and control. But to your point too, I think things that are newer, things that we don't understand or don't have direct experience with, is easy to fear. It's easy to say,
Sure.
you're going to now take over society. And when I'm like, or are they just getting the same freedoms that you are? That's a different story. But also, one of the things we haven't talked about at all with regards to this is the pressure of social media and just technology, and how that has influenced
Oh, of course.
adolescence. And but I think it's twofold, because I think back to, coming up in high school in the 90s, and I never saw even a mid-sized model, right? And all of the messages I got was emaciated, be as thin and
Right.
as possible. And I think, wow, if I would have had influencers who were showing me a different type of body, how might I have changed my perspective? If I would have met people who were spiritual and queer, I just
Yeah.
think there are also some really incredible elements to that as well. But yeah, lots of nuance.
Yeah, whose order, right? That's the thing. Like
Yes.
I think that's when you talk about politics, it's like that's what they're fighting for. Like the Democrats have a certain idea of what order is, the Republicans have a certain idea of what order is. And before it's been democratic, it's like, okay, well, whoever got the most votes gets to pick, right? And
Right.
gets to kind of dictate what happens. And it's like that is even unraveling now. Like with Trump,
Yeah.
he's basically unraveled the order that was in the like a lot of people don't like the way patriarchal is kind of a loaded word, but the way that the political
Yeah.
structure has been laid out, it's like, well, it's too dogmatic. There's, we don't have any freedoms within it or whatever. But again, it's ordered, right? So
Yeah.
as soon as the order goes, it's like then people start struggling. Like, okay, what are we going to believe? Because there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing concrete. There's nothing to hold on to. And as soon as people feel like there's nothing to hold on to, they want to faction out. They want to find their own identity. And then
That's right.
that in and of itself starts creating a threat to order.
Yeah.
And it's like the whole thing just starts to kind of steamroll on itself. And it's like, how do we find a place
Mm-hmm.
where, people can be who they are
Yeah.
and kind of be accepted within that? And I think
Yeah.
on some level, that's more of a democratic perspective. I'm Canadian,
Right.
so I don't know a whole lot about US politics, but this is kind of what I see as an external. And the Republicans seem to be more like, okay, they're kind of old school order. They're more likely to be sort of Christian, this
Yeah.
kind of thing. And it's like, how do we find a new order when there's so much division? And then
Right.
you have a leader in Trump who just sows division. Like people say,
Yeah.
like, are you for or against Trump? It's like, it's not really, that's really not the question. It's basically, he seems to be a person who's very divisive,
Yeah.
right? He seems to be splitting people. And that's what I said. It's like when you get into this place where you feel off balance, you look for your tribe, right?
That's right.
And the more out there the tribe's views are, the more you kind of coalesce together, because
That's
it's like,
right.
okay, well, we believe that there's no, we should have no abortion at all, like none. It's like, okay, I believe the same thing. We'll all, and those people, because it's so
Yeah.
intense, tend to gravitate together in this sort of, place. And
Yeah.
then they're the most fervent opponents of, what other people would say, well, that's just women's healthcare. Like we should just give that
Yes.
to women, right? So
Right.
it's fascinating to just watch
Yeah.
how society, because the States, it used to be Japan, but now the States is kind of the microcosm of human, where we're going as humanity. You used to be able to look at Japan and
Yeah.
say, okay, that's where we're going, right? AI girlfriends, all this kind of stuff, highly
Mm-hmm.
technological. Now we look at the States, it's like, now this is a more humanistic way of seeing how we separate from each other.
And then you get the fall of Rome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Right.
yeah, when you have all of this hubris and you have all of this division and then people continuing to double down and not fostering any sort of understanding of what's
Right.
going on, then and you have a media influence that, you know, people who are middle of the road, which is a large swath of us, that doesn't make the news, right?
No.
The only thing that's going to make ratings are the
Right.
extremists. And so then
Right.
you get this
Skewed.
dichotomy,
Yep.
a false sense of dichotomy too, because so many people are not that extreme at all.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I remember having a conversation with a really conservative friend of mine, and I was explaining to her the ramifications of abortion access and how that keeps people in poverty. And okay, so you must then, if you're pro-life, you must then be for a lot of social programs to help that child grow. Of course they're not.
No.
So then when we started conversing in that way, she went, "Oh shit. I never thought of that." And I'm like, "Well, probably not, because that's not going to be a buzz phrase or
It's going to
talking
threaten
point."
their belief system.
That's exactly right. So, needless to say, we've got some bug out bags and because who the fuck knows? But
Yeah.
but yeah, I find these conversations really stimulating and curious, because so much of it is about being understood and
Mm-hmm.
about and truly about fear of what happens if things change
Right.
and if other people have freedoms or visibility or afforded privileges. And it can be disarming or discouraging and scary for a lot of folks. But um I still am a kind of a consummate optimist in the way that I do genuinely believe that there is a lot of hope, and I do see a lot of incredible people standing up and having their voice heard, and not just in the political space, but in a lot of spaces where their voice was just never valued, which is also why I feel strongly about the work that I do too.
So what would you say, if you had a magic wand and you could change the world with one thing, but you could only change one thing, what would you change?
Emotional intelligence, like without question. Emotional intelligence um, for everybody. I mean,
And what does that
so
mean?
if are you familiar with Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown? Is her most
Yeah.
recent book. Yeah.
Yep.
So when she wrote this, which is essentially kind of a vade mecum or a reference guide of, I think there's 82 different human emotions or experiences. Well, when she originally polled a group of 7,000 plus folks and said, how many emotions can you name?
Mm.
And on average, three. That was it.
Okay.
Mad, glad, and sad. And
Okay.
so the whole premise of the book is if we are not astute enough and have the vocabulary enough to say what's happening for us, then we're not able to advocate for our needs. We're not able to self soothe. We're not able to emotionally regulate. And I think that would change a lot of the way that we engage with the world. I think, unfortunately, we tell a lot of little boys that they've got to cut off all of their intuition and their sensitive side. And we say the only emotion you're really allowed to have is anger. We can put up with you being angry, but we can't put up with you being soft or sad or quiet or, despondent. So we have this really arrested development then in emotional intelligence for a large grouping of the population, and then they're maligned for that. And then we see that also in the queer community, because if you are a man who exhibits feminine
Mm-hmm.
behavior, now we need to shit all over you because that's demonized, and we want the hierarchy to be one of quote strength. So in my perspective, I feel like the more able we are to understand the breadth of human emotion and to recognize that what emotion is messaging, period. And I know you've talked about that a lot with anxiety, that
Mm-hmm.
it's just sending you a message. And the same way we would look at physical pain, like if my knee is hurting, I'm not going to be mad at my knee or frustrated. I'm going to go, oh shit, something's awry. There's some messaging
Right.
happening here. I need to go rectify that. Same is true if I'm feeling grief, sadness, overwhelm, stress, anxiety, or bliss, ecstasy, joy, happiness. Those are messages to say, hey, bitch, pay attention. We need to fix this or run towards this. This does bring us good emotion. But we don't qualify emotion like that in our culture. And then we tell women largely, like, if you want to get ahead, you need to be more masculine. And that whole paradigm of masculine versus feminine makes me want to pull my teeth out
Mm.
because it feels so genderized. And what we're just talking about is when strength is being called for and when softness is being called for. And we all have that capacity. We all have that need. And you know this with neuroscience, like most of the decisions that we make, if not all of them, are based off of emotion, what we
Yes.
think we will
Without a
feel.
doubt.
So
Yep.
why are we shutting that down and demonizing it and saying that being sensitive or emotional is akin to calling somebody a slut or, a
Right.
bitch? And it's like, no, 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 that's a motherfucking superpower in a
Right.
culture that tells you don't feel. I can't think of anything more brave.
Yeah, well, it threatens the order. Like that's the thing. I think human beings were naturally drawn to order.
Yeah.
So anything that threatens that order, especially in a milieu of trauma like we're in now, or certainly uncertainty,
Yep.
um, Lisa Feldman Barrett has a book called How Emotions Are Made, and in that book, she
Mm.
talks about the more emotion words you know, the more the more emotionally literate you are.
Yes.
I don't know if it's cause or effect or whatever, and it is really interesting to see that when you can call the nuances of emotion like envy or jealousy or
Yes.
you know you're able to be more emotionally literate. Now you ask men, I mean, if you ask women about emotions, like name a number of emotions, I would bet that you could get women to name so many more than men, right? And then you
I
mentioned
don't know.
earlier that anger is one of those ones that that is sort of allowed in men. Yet we medicate the crap out of boys who are ADHD, right? Because
Right.
their anger shows up that way. And then we take tears away from boys. Gordon
Yes.
Neufeld, who's my mentor in developmental psychology, talks about how tears are adaptive. When your dog has died, or you're going through a divorce, you're still going through a divorce and your dog is still dead, but after you have some tears, your perception of those things is lighter. And I think when we take
Yes.
that away from men, basically they kill themselves.
Well, right. And we have epidemics of loneliness, right?
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, gosh, I feel so strongly about this as well. And now because of perimenopause, I totally lost my train of thought.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We'll blame it on that. We'll blame it on that.
I do that all the time, even though it's probably not accurate.
Well, yeah. It's, again, that's order, right? Like,
Yeah.
it makes sense to, like, human beings want things to make sense. Yet we have this desire for novelty, and we have this desire for uncertainty, yet this aversion to it at the same time. And if you're traumatized as a child, what a lot of what I call anxiety is basically, uncertainty, intolerance.
Right.
Like, we just don't tolerate uncertainty. So we try and make things as certain as possible. So, when someone is queer or gay or whatever on the spectrum, that threatens your level of certainty, and
That's right.
especially, and I think the reason why a lot of people gravitate towards religion is it provides this sense of certainty, this dogma,
That's right.
and then you can't go outside of that, because as soon as you go outside of it, you're threatening your own sense of order, which is kind of where we're at right now, is that there's so much uncertainty in the world. We're looking towards an ordered universe. And this is why this sort of make America great again thing is so popular. Is like, America never was great.
No.
Canada never was great. We've never been great.
Right. For
And
who?
it's this idea. Yeah, it's idea. And this is this urge to command some sense of order, which is, I think, what MAGA is. It's like, okay, well, there was this order back then when there wasn't, and we can just pretend that this order is really helping us. So we're going to go back to this place of order, which is, no abortions, gay is bad, all this kind of stuff. And it's just, it really rots our sense of evolution as human beings when we can't allow uncertainty, because uncertainty is the birthplace of growth.
Right. Right. I mean, it's very much akin to boredom is the catalyst to creativity.
Totally.
Right. Along those same lines. But again, the way our mind works, as you know, is like, we want to close the loop. We don't like these unending, just, we'll see what happens. We want that structure. We want that order. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we continue to root for an abuser or our parents or
Right.
people who are routinely showing us that they're not coming through for us. We don't ever stop rooting for them. And then something that I see happen pretty consistently is folks will start working for somebody who is emblematic of someone in their past. So now they have a do-over of like, okay, I tried to please dad, or I tried to please mom, and now I'm in a workplace where that boss really reminds me a lot of that dynamic. So maybe this is my do-over. And so then we have to contend with that defense mechanism to kind of come full circle of people pleasing in a way that looks a lot like how I stayed safe as a child. But now this is infringing on my autonomy, my agency, my progression in my career. And so that's typically when I bump up against folks who are really reckoning with, oh, wow, this tactic is no longer working for me. This is no longer keeping me safe.
Which threatens that internal order that we had when we were children. I mean, Freud called it the repetition compulsion. Basically, to repeat the unconscious familiarity we had in childhood in our adulthood. So we pick a boss who's like our dad. We pick a partner who's like our mother. Like, it basically comes in. We're so, human beings are indoctrinated in a way to associate familiarity with security.
Right.
So religion is a classic example of that. It's just like, okay, I'm familiar with this, so I'm going to be secure in this, and then everyone else who's in this club, I'm also secure with them either. But it's just a big illusion, right? It's just a big illusion, because everybody within that group, there's a lot of people who grew up in religion who were gay, and it's like, well, I don't feel like I'm part of this, but I have to pretend that I'm in this group because there's a belonging sense, so you
Yes.
sacrifice your authenticity for that sense of attachment, which is what I think a lot of
Hmm.
psychopathology comes exactly from. That as children, we sacrifice our authentic self to be this reactive self that we think other people need. Now, you and I could talk forever, but you talked about emotional intelligence. So
Yes,
how do you create, because you work mostly with women, right?
I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do you create this emotional intelligence with women?
Well, that is the first module of a 9 module program that is sort of my signature program. It's called Worthy. And we jump off with that because I feel like it permeates every single
Sure.
element of the rest of what we do. And we do, inner child work, a bunch of things. But one of the pieces that I feel very strongly about, which landed me in the field of hypnosis and hypnotherapy, is changing that wiring at the subconscious level.
Yes.
So if
Yeah.
somebody has a disconnect between what they know consciously and what they feel subconsciously, you are going to have nonstop difficulty with traditional coaching or therapy models
Sure.
because, again, depends who you talk to, but the conscious part of our mind is what, roughly 5 to 10%, 12%. Depends who you talk
Who
to.
knows?
Yeah,
Yeah.
who the fuck
We
knows?
don't know. It
Here it's
again, is that human compulsive need for order. That other thing about, we process 40 billion bits of information. Who knows that? Like, it's just, when I hear that, it makes no sense to me. You can't quantify something like that. Anyway, I interrupted you.
right. Or when people say, like, you're going to walk by 36 murders in your lifetime. And I'm
Right.
like, how do you know that?
Yeah. Hopefully it's not the last one you meet.
Gosh, yes,
Mm.
absolutely. Um, Now I forgot where I was
No, I
going.
was just saying, like, with women, like with your clients, like, what
Oh,
is it? You
yes.
take them through the Worthy program, which I believe
Oh,
Worthy
yes.
can be kind of interchanged with safety. So initially it's producing the
Mhm.
sense of safety, and then from safety we can kind of branch into kind of who we are, kind of thing.
Yeah, so we do hypnosis in every single module, and one of the pieces of that to help anchor into that subconscious mind is that it's safe to access my emotions.
Mm,
And, in certain families, you grow up learning, this is not uncommon to hear, like the only thing you're allowed to be is happy. And so if you are having a tantrum, upset, frustrated, we don't want to see that. And so you need to go to your room. Nobody
time
wants to
out.
be around that.
Time
Exactly.
out. Yep.
And I had a really fortunate situation, and I advocate this for anybody who is a parent now, where my dad would allow me to embody various emotions by saying, okay, show me excited. And then I would go, ah, and like do this excited face. Show me scared, and so, I mean, perhaps it was the beginning of my thespian endeavors, but it also taught me very early on that there's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad, there's just messaging from
Mm,
emotions. And so we start off with that. We do a ton of different tools and tactics. And then we move into things like fear and understanding our fear responses and how that's showing up now, and the inner critic or critical factor of the mind, moving into inner child work. And so we kind of, the trajectory is one of, let's dismantle the shit that we know is not working,
mm,
and then move towards cultivating an identity and creating a belief system that really works for who you want to be. And so one of the things that I'm always telling people is, here's my gut, or here's my assessment. Try that on. Does that feel real to you? Does that feel true for you? Because the last thing I want are people who are dependent on me
yes.
to have the answer or the solution, when that's antithetical to personal growth. I always tell them, personal growth is called personal for a reason, because it's
Yeah.
fucking personal.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a different right answer every single time. But I do feel very strongly that when we have that emotional acuity and intelligence and vernacular around it, we're able to advocate for ourselves so much more fully and
Mm.
express the breadth of
And
human
become
emotion
more of
too.
our authentic self. I think that's really, we grow up in this
Mhm.
environment that makes us a reactive self. And part of that cultural, part of it, it's just like we have to stop at red lights. Like, part of it is who we are. But as you get older, and then Hollis talks about that too, is like, as you get into the second half of life, it's like, okay, the first half of life was, what does society expect of me? And then the last half is like, if you're lucky, is what do I expect of myself? And I think
Yeah.
that's, how you're helping, women specifically, but everybody kind of
Yeah.
understand, that there is this unconscious well. And unless we bring, unless we make the unconscious conscious, it will rule our lives and we'll call it fate, the old Jung expression, right? So
That's right.
thanks,
That's
Amy.
right.
This has been great. How do people find you?
Sure. So my corner of the internet is over at amygreensmith.com, and all of those names are spelled the
The
basic
way you
bitch
think.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what as soon as I
Not,
saw your name, it's like, that's good.
that's
That's an easy
easy.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, never has been butchered ever in my
Yeah.
lifetime. amygreensmith.com. And I've got tons of freebies over there. Depending on when this airs, I have, my signature program, Worthy, that I also take people through one-on-one. And I do work with men in that capacity.
Okay.
But in the group immersion, I do a small group of women leaders. And like any self-respecting Gen Xer, I hang out the most on Instagram. My handle is Hey Amy Greensmith. And yeah, so come over to my site, grab some freebies, and I would be incredibly honored to connect.
Thanks, Amy. I'm sure we'll talk again. I mean, we could talk forever, but I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, I had a blast, Russ. Thank you so much.